Advanced Residential Applications and Case Studies. Chapter 2, Advanced Residential Appraisal Concepts, page 17. Scope of Work Acceptability. The scope of work rule next provides us with a couple of ways to measure the acceptability of our scope of work decision. Again, as important as this is in a typical appraisal, applying these tests to our scope of work decision in the appraisal of a complex property is critical. The rule says the scope of work is acceptable when it meets or exceeds the expectations of parties who are regularly intended users for similar assignments, and what an appraiser's peers' actions would be in performing the same or a similar assignment. You should be careful to think beyond the expectations of your particular client as you make this assessment, because often your client is not sophisticated or knowledgeable enough to know what to expect of you in the appraisal of any property, let alone a complex one. So you must compare your scope of work decision to the expectations of parties who would typically use such an appraisal and also are well informed and know what to expect of an appraiser in such an assignment. The second means of determining the acceptability of your scope of work merely requires you to recognize who your peers are. USPAP defines appraisers' peers as appraisers' peers, other appraisers who have expertise and competency in a similar type of assignment. The scope of work rule warns the appraiser not to allow assignment conditions to limit the scope of work to such a degree that the assignment results are not credible in the context of the intended use. If you are asked to appraise a property under conditions which limit your scope of work to the point that you do not believe you can develop credible assignment results, then you must withdraw from the assignment unless the scope of work can be modified sufficiently for credible results. Or perhaps you can develop enough information from reliable sources sufficient to develop extraordinary assumptions in order to complete the assignment properly. This problem commonly occurs when the appraiser is asked to appraise a property without the opportunity to physically examine it to any significant extent. While such a limited level of observation is not unusual, these are often called exterior only or drive-by appraisals. You may find it very difficult to appraise a complex property without the benefit of physically observing the land and improvements at a relatively thorough level. The scope of work rule reminds the appraiser that the client's intended use must not result in the appraisal opinions and conclusions being biased. Often, especially in the appraisal of property for mortgage loan decisions, the client may prefer and even ask the appraiser to gloss over or not mention one or more characteristics of the property that add to the complexity of the property. Such information in the appraisal report, they may say, will kill the deal or make the loan package unmarketable. Hopefully, you realize already that to comply with such a request would be bad, very bad. You must recognize and analyze and disclose the relevant characteristics of the property in the appraisal report, even when doing so may upset your client or interfere with their business interests. Finally, the scope of work rule elaborates a bit more on the requirement for scope of work disclosure in the appraisal report. Keep in mind that many of the concepts we are reviewing now will be revisited in more detail later in the course when we look at particular appraisal applications and case studies. So be sure to pay careful attention to these concepts as we continue to address them, because you will be applying them in the hands-on work in subsequent sections of this course. End of page. Quiz. Page 18. Check your understanding. This quiz has a total of 3 questions. There will be 1 question per page. You must achieve 65% to pass this quiz. Start quiz. Number 1. How is the credibility of assignment results measured? A. Within the context of the intended use. B. Based on an absolute scale. C. If the client can use the report to achieve his/her objective. Or D. By dividing the appraisal fee by the number of hours the appraiser worked on it. I'm going to go probably A, within the context of the intended use. Number 2. The scope of work rule states that appraisers have broad blank and significant blank in determining the scope of work. A. Flexibility and responsibility. B. Flexibility and discretion. C. Responsibility and credibility. Or D. Discretion and credibility. It's either A or B. I'm just trying to remember what the last one was. Significant responsibility or significant discretion? Because I already know it's broad flexibility, but I'm trying to remember what came after significant. And significant responsibility or significant discretion? I think it's discretion. I could be wrong on that. It's either A or B though. And lastly, number 3, worthy of belief is the USPAP definition for A. Credible. B. Reliable. C. Scope of work. Or D. Value. I'm going to go A. Credible. You passed and finish. You passed. You got a 66.7%. So remember, number one, how is the credibility of assignment results measured? You said A, within the context of the intended use, and that was correct. Number two, the scope of work rule states that appraisers have broad blank and significant blank in determining the scope of work. You said B, flexibility and discretion, and that was incorrect. The correct answer was A, flexibility and responsibility. That was the word that I couldn't remember. The scope of work rule states, in part, appraisers have broad flexibility and significant responsibility in determining the appropriate scope of work for an appraisal, appraisal review, and appraisal consulting assignment. Chapter 2, Scope of Work and Appraisal Responsibilities. Number 3, worthy of belief is the USPAP definition for. You said A, credible, and that was correct.